Game of Thrones ended with Cersei being defeated by architecture, Dany deciding to be Dragon Hitler, and Jon saying, hey, snow forever, yay! And if you look at all those three things and go, well, what was the point of the story? What was the message? What were we trying to get at? You'd be very confused, because there really wasn't one in the TV series. But the book series, I think, is very different, because unlike the TV showrunners who said that themes are for 8th grade book reports, George R.R. Martin seems to have an idea of what the whole point of the series is. But do I have to listen to what he thinks the ultimate point or theme of the story is, or can I look at the text and say, no, I've determined that these are the themes, that this is the point based on my reading of it? Welcome to more literary analysis for y'all. It's been a minute. I'm going to teach you things, so sit there and listen to me yap. Okay, so we're going to break down the two kind of like grandpas of literary analysis and how they don't get along because they're literally the opposite of one another. And we're going to use both of them to explain, do we have to listen to George and what George says, or can I just like say whatever the fuck I want based on my reading of the story? If you haven't guessed it by now, these two concepts are pretty simple. There is structuralism, and then there is post-structuralism or after-structuralism. Post-structuralism is where we get the concept death of the author, which I will break down a little bit because boy do people misuse it and I'm losing my mind. Okay, so let's start off with a very basic breakdown of these two concepts. Believe me, I recognize that these are very overly simplified, but it's all for time. So, structuralism is the first kind of like literary analysis lens that gets very, very popular because it makes it very easy to take in a piece of media and filter it through this like analysis lens. Why? Well, because it's all about structure. So structuralism was developed essentially by this guy named Saussure. Saussure was a linguist. And so his whole thing was that everything fit together. And he wanted to like figure out how that worked through language. Okay, this is going to sound a little complicated, but his whole thing was he was trying to figure out like how meaning was derived from words. And so he would like look at a word and be like, okay, so there is a collection of sounds that we're making that makes the word. But then there is like a like physical like symbol description thing, like symbols on the page like you're writing that also mean that word. And it's the combination of the sounds with like the visible symbol that creates the sign, which is like what the thing is. And then the way this thing gets meaning attributed to it is how it fits in within the context of all these other signs. Stay with me, I promise it'll make sense. So if I say something along the lines of like, my shirt is red, it derives its meaning from the words that I have put in that order and the fact that I have specified those words to the exclusion of others. So the fact that I've said red and not blue, green, whatever means it is red. The fact that I've said shirt instead of pants or whatever is what makes it shirt. And so it's the combination of like those words in the order. The context is what gives it meaning. I've done a terrible job of explaining it. Look it up online, it's fine. The point that I want you to get is the idea of structuralism is that the context is everything. So if you are doing a structuralist analysis of a piece of media, of a story, whatever, you are looking for how the parts of the story fit together with how the story fits within your knowledge of the author, and then how like the story fits in with your knowledge of like current events at the time that it was written. Star Trek gets brought up a lot as a great example for structuralism and like structuralist analysis, because Star Trek was always dealing in like metaphors of the day. So like in the 60s, you couldn't really like talk about like the, I don't know, like the tensions between the US and Russia in like a very plain way. So what do? You make the Russians the Klingons, and then you make America the Federation, and then you write like a story where there's all this political intrigue. And if you just look at it and like plug in the appropriate people, you're like, oh, I get what this is saying. I get what the message is, because I understand the structure in which this story fits within, the context with which it fits within. Now, post-structuralists were basically the people that came after, like, okay, but what if like the structure didn't matter? What if the context doesn't matter? What if it's like literally like just what's on the page? What if I can like say whatever I want based just what's on there? Now, the structuralists were like, ew, no, but like the author meant it to be about this and this and this, and the post-structuralists were like, yeah. What if he doesn't matter? Which is where you get death of the author. Death of the author was, again, a theory, another like lens you could analyze things through by a theorist named Roland Barthes. And to summarize it so that people stop misusing it, the idea of death of the author, if you want to do an analysis with like death of the author in mind, is that you are only using the text. You are not using any contextual knowledge that you have of the piece. If you know that this book about a civil war was written during like the Civil War of the United States in the 1860s, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You can't use that as context. If you know that the author hated a particular minority, and then like, oh, this like fantasy series, this fantasy species in the book looks like that minority, you have to ignore that, because that's the context that isn't like directly represented within the textual like evidence of the page. The idea of this being like, if 1,000 years from now we find a book, but we've lost like all the other knowledge like about it, about like all the context, who wrote it, etc., all we're gonna have to go off of is this book. So let's do all of our research and all of our interpretation based on what's actually in the text. Now, where this can get a little sticky and some people get uncomfortable is sometimes like authors have specific intents and will say so like after the fact, but the proponents of death of the author will be like, well, if you didn't make that clear enough in the text, that I just have the wiggle room to interpret it as I like. Now, something to keep in mind with death of the author. Death of the author is not a rule. I've had people like, when I argue something like based on like, oh, well, George has clarified this, they'll be like, well, death of the author, so it doesn't count. Okay, death of the author is a lens that I can choose to interpret media through. It's not a hard and fast rule. It hasn't been put on me. So if I decide, actually, no, I don't want to look at this piece with death of the author in mind, I don't have to, and neither do you, okay? So how do these both apply to possibilities for like what the whole point of the series is? Well, let me give you two kind of like big themes that I've talked about that like I have feelings about for being like what the overall point of the series is, and one of them will be through a structuralist lens, and then one of them will be through a post-structuralist or death of the author lens. Okay, so let's start off with the idea that the entire series is just a big metaphor for climate change. I have talked about this before because I think that when I like read the text, it seems very apparent. You're watching all of these people engage in these conflicts for the Iron Throne, a thing that ultimately doesn't matter, because the true danger, the true like scary force that's actually going to end humanity is the others, and that's coming from the North. But we as a society, or I should say Westeros, isn't looking at the North, isn't looking at the true danger, because they are distracted by like the small time arguments, the small time political squabbles. Now, from what I've just explained, it's very easy to plug in climate change and be like, oh, it's all just a climate change metaphor. Like, the world is worrying about stupid shit while climate change is getting worse and is eventually going to, you know, destroy all living life on the planet. And we could be focusing on that, but we're focusing on the other dumb stuff instead. Dumb! And, like, I'm not the only one who has said this. People have said this long before I have. But when George was specifically asked about this, and like, hey, so is it all a climate change metaphor? He said, no, not really, actually. He's like, I don't mind that, and I see how people get there, and I don't think, like, it's a bad analysis, but was that my intent? No, it wasn't. So what I've just described, the idea that A Song of Ice and Fire is a big climate change metaphor, that is just fully something that the internet has come up with. That is a death of the author analysis that's post-structuralist. You are just looking at the text and creating an interpretation for yourself based on what you're reading. It doesn't have to come from the author himself. And remember, in a death of the author analysis, this is totally okay to do, because the idea is the second, I should have mentioned this when I was explaining death of the author, the idea behind it is the second the author has like given over the book and has stopped writing and gives it to the audience, the author dies and the book now belongs to the audience. That makes sense? So, once again, recapping climate change as like the metaphor for the whole series. It's a great interpretation, but it is a death of the author interpretation. It comes from just reading the text. It does not come from the man himself. Now let's do a structuralist analysis of what I think the whole point of the series is about, based on my knowledge of George, his writing, his history and beliefs, etc. Obviously in concert with what I'm reading in the books. So this week in our recording of the podcast, Song of Spice and Ronnie, which is my read-along podcast for if you want to read the Game of Thrones books with me and my friend Spicer, you can do so. We got to Ned Stark's final chapter. Also, it's posted in the other place if you want to, go listen along, whatever, yeah? Links in places. Ned's final chapter is fascinating to me because I believe it encapsulates everything I know about George R. R. Martin and his feelings on the world in this one chapter, and really synthesizes what is the point of this series? What is the thing that we are trying to build towards, and what is it that we are trying to avoid? And the answer to that is we are trying to avoid war. Why are we trying to avoid war? Because at the end of the day, the people who suffer from war the most are always the poor, the small folk, the common man. And this theme of who are the actual victims of war gets brought up throughout the series, but the first time that I think it gets brought up really succinctly and kind of thrown in the face of one of these lords who, to our eyes is one of the more empathetic ones, is this scene, Ned Stark's final scene, where Varys visits him in the dungeons and is imploring him, please, I need you to confess that you lied about the king, Joffrey being illegitimate, so that we can keep the realm at peace for a little while longer. We do not want an all-out war right now. And Ned is refusing. He's I don't understand. Why would I do you think that I value my life that much? Why would I do that? Why would I dishonor myself in that way? And this is ridiculous. I won't do that. And Varys is getting more and more impatient with him because that's not the point. And then he drops what I think is just one of the best lines of the whole series, where he says, "Why is it always the innocents who suffer the most when you High Lords play your Game of Thrones? Ponder it." And it's that right there. That is the synthesis of what it's all about. These wars are hurting the wrong people. These High Lords want to play their Game of Thrones. They want to live in this world where, their honor and their oaths have so much importance that, if you come into direct conflict with them, it is better that thousands of innocent poor people die than they just deal with it amongst themselves. Now, why am I saying that this is the whole point of the series? Well, because I know things about George R. R. Martin. I know things about his history. George R. R. Martin was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. He refused to go because he did not think it was ethical to go and, murder people who he did not have an actual conflict with. And beyond that, conscientious objectors had a problem with the fact that we were letting all of these young people die over the conflicts of the American government. The American government, who wanted to make a point about, communism in the world, was willing to let thousands upon thousands of their own citizens die so that they could make that point, which inevitably they didn't actually get to do very well. So the mission is unfulfilled, and instead, tens of thousands of Americans are now dead. Why? Because the High Lords wanted to play their Game of Thrones. Now, you'll notice that both of the explanations for the point of the series, you can kind of relate them to each other a little bit. In the Death of the Author one with the climate change, there is a fight going on which isn't the true fight, and it's a waste of time. Here, I'm talking a little bit more about the fight itself and why it is immoral in and of itself. But this one, I'm specifically leaning into those elements more because of the context I know about George, because I know these parts of his history, and then I'm able to look at the book series with that in mind. I'm seeing these themes pop up repeatedly. Later on, when we are going through the Riverlands, which again are George's big, his big example of what happens, the horrors of war. But when we're in the Riverlands with Brienne, we meet a Septon Maribald, who goes over the dangers of war and what it turns men into. And he has this big, insane monologue about what he calls broken men. Broken men are essentially soldiers that end up being so traumatized by being in war that they eventually break and desert and become these outlaws who are just traumatized, and they're stealing, and they've lost all of their humanity at this point. And for someone, again, who was alive around the Vietnam War, objected to it on moral grounds, and then we would later come to see the effects that it would have on these returning soldiers, I think that I can see the real world parallels that George is pulling from. And so this therefore fits into my structuralist analysis of the text based on its relation to the author. I did funny business so this video could be longer, and even then, I know I've kind of done like a piss poor job of explaining both parts. They should have probably been two separate videos, but please let me know. Are there any other like specific literary concepts you want me to talk about? Do you want me to talk about these more? Do you want me to talk about structuralism a little bit more, or post-structuralism, death of the author, etc.? Please let me know in the comments. Like, do press all the buttons. Y'all are cool, and yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye!